Well, welcome once again to a teaching on faith. And specifically, the title of this teaching is The Faithfulness of God. I want to have as much faith, as much trust and confidence in God as I can have. If I increase my faith, I know I will increase seeing the power of God in my life. And one of the things that I believe has increased my faith, and as I've seen other people and their faith increase, is understanding the faithfulness of God. That what God says He will do, He will do. You know, when God says that He is love, that doesn't mean that He's only loving part of the time. That, in other words, it's an aspect of God that God is completely loving and He's always loving. Another thing about God is when God says He's faithful, He's always faithful. God is not like you or me that want to be faithful, but then we're not. Or want to be loving, but aren't always necessarily loving. When God says He's love, He is always love. And when God says He's faithful, He was always faithful. What God says He'll do, He will absolutely do. God would have to break His own rules of the universe for Him to go contrary to His nature, and He won't. If He says He is something, then He is. Now just think for a minute, what are some of the physical things that God has set in place in His creation which help us to understand His faithfulness? Well, think for a minute. Think about the natural world. Are there any examples that you can think of that prove the faithfulness of God? Well, when I asked some people, one of the things that someone said to me once is, absolutely, I never ever have a day in which I know that the sun does not rise in the east. Every 24 hours the sun comes up, and every day the sun sets. God is faithful. What He has set in motion happens continually. You know, the same thing is, I never am in the middle of winter and have to worry that spring is not going to come. Spring always follows winter, and so too summer following spring and fall following summer. The seasons are faithful because God is faithful and He set them in motion. I never look up at the sky and have to worry that the stars are going to fall down or that they're going to move out of place. God set them where He wanted to, and they demonstrate His faithfulness. Creation has the very indelible fingerprint of God pressed upon it. And God is faithful, therefore God's creation is faithful. And we can see that through many physical examples. God gives us the rains, He gives us seasons. You know, we just can see this all over through the natural realm. You know, the atomic order of things, chemistry. If you add, you know, the proper amount of hydrogen and oxygen, you end up with water every time. If I jump off a building, I'll hit the ground every time because of the laws that God has set in motion because He's faithful. But God also has given us His Word, and His Word increases our faith because we see that God, through the many stories and the things He tells in His Word, that God is faithful. Moses knew this. In Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse 9, I'd like to read that. It says, "Know therefore that the Lord your God is God. He is the faithful God." Moses understood the faithfulness of God. Now that may have taken time for it to build in Moses' life, but eventually Moses got to the place that he knew what God told him to do. He trusted in it every time, and it always happened. It goes on and says that He's a faithful God, keeping His covenant, keeping His word, His laws of love. See, God is both faithful and loving all the time. He cannot break that. And it says He keeps His covenant of love to 1,000 generations of those who love Him and keep His commands. Also in Deuteronomy chapter 32, it says, I'll pick this up in verse 4, 32:4. It says, "He is the rock. His works are perfect, and all His ways are just. A faithful God who does no wrong, upright and just is He." Again, Moses understood the faithfulness of God, and that's what allowed Moses to have great confidence, trust, faith in God, because he understood the faithfulness of God. David also understood the faithfulness of God. In 2 Samuel chapter 22, It says in verse 25, "The Lord has rewarded me according to my righteousness, according to my cleanness in his sight. To the faithful you show yourself faithful. To the blameless you show yourself blameless. To the pure you show yourself pure. But to the crooked you show yourself shrewd." David knew that God was a faithful God, and to those who trusted in him, who were faithful to him, he would be trustful or faithful back to them. Also in Psalm 33, verse 4, "For the word of the Lord is right and true. He is faithful in all he does." You do not have to question God's faithfulness. You know, it's a trick of the mind sometimes is, why won't God do this for me? God is faithful. Trust it. What he says he will do for you, he will do. Now, many times there may be circumstances, there's a spiritual battle, there can be interference that comes our way. You know, we need to pray, we need to pray, we need to pray. We need to do everything that we can possibly do. But you can always trust in God. And without trust or confidence in God, it's impossible to please him. Because God requires all that come to him know that he exists and that he is a loving and true and faithful God. Trust it. You can trust the promises of God. In Psalm 145, verse 13, "Your kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and your dominion endures through all generations. The Lord is faithful to all his promises." You know, there's another teaching that I gave that someone wrote one time and he said, "Well, am I a bad Christian if I don't read my Bible?" You know, I'm not worried about being bad or good. I'm more worried you're ignorant. I mean, who wants to be an ignorant Christian? Ignorant means someone who just doesn't know. I mean, it's like, gee, you know, there's $1,000 or $1 million check sitting underneath this blotter on my desk. But if I'm ignorant of it, it does me absolutely no good. You know, ignorance causes us to trust in things and think that God does things that he doesn't do. And then the things that he says he does do, we don't trust those. Why? Because we'd be ignorant of God's promises. And Psalm 145 verse 13 says, "The Lord is faithful to all his promises." If I'm going to have faith, trust, confidence in God, I've got to know his promises. There's thousands of promises in here. There's stories of victory and there's stories of defeat. There's stories that I can learn from and be encouraged, and I can increase my trust in God when I understand the faithfulness of God, faithful to all his promises. You know, there are promises that we can hold on to in times of trouble. There's promises that we need to understand when we minister to our brothers and sisters. There's promises that say that he has given us the Spirit. He promises that if you trust him, you can walk out, you can speak in tongues, you can minister, you can prophesy, you can heal, you can do the works that Jesus Christ said you can do. But you'll never do them if you don't have trust, if you don't have confidence in the promises of God. There's many, many verses. And just do a word search sometime. Just get out your concordance and look up faithful. And look at how many things it says that God is faithful to. David understood as faithful. And remember, in 2 Samuel 22 or 26, verse 26, it says, "To the faithful you show yourself faithful." Well, I want to be a man of faith, and I trust that you do too. And I want to be the kind of person that when people need healing, when they're sick, when they're down, when they need encouragement, I want to be the kind of person that can be an answer for their prayers, an answer of God for their prayers. And that's going to require that we be people of trust, confidence, faith. God is faithful.
Some days I forget that I'm free, and sometimes my feet don't want to carry